Hi, everyone. You can hear me now? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Lin, and I'm currently serving as chair of the WashU Pride Alumni Network. And I hope everyone had a great coming out day earlier this month as well. On behalf of WUPAN, WashU Hillel, and the DC and Baltimore Alumni Network, I am excited to welcome you to More Than Just Hummus, featuring two outstanding members of the WashU alumni community. Before we begin, I would like to explain the format for today's session. You will only hear and see me and our presenters today, and this webinar will last for about an hour. Following the conversation, we will have time for questions, and we do encourage you to participate by asking questions at any time by typing in the Q&A box. Thank you to all of you who have already submitted questions via your registration. And during the Q&A session, we will try to get to as many questions as we are able to. This webinar is also being recorded, and we will share it on the Alumni Association YouTube channel and on the website following the event. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce and welcome Lars Etzkorn. Lars is a 1987 graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences, and he was a founding member and subsequent chair of the WashU Pride Alumni Network, and continues to be an enthusiastic advocate and supporter for the organization. Currently, Lars serves as a member of the WashU Alumni Board of Governors, and he is an estate planning attorney in Washington, DC. Please join me in welcoming Lars Etzkorn.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm pleased to be part of this discussion with Matt about his book, More Than Just Hummus, A Gay Jew Discovers Israel in Arabic. It's good to be with Matt again. Several years ago, the two of us did a networking tutorial for WashU students in DC, and Matt is a member of WUPAN and comes to its events in DC. I look forward to learning more about Matt's time in Israel and lessons learned. First, though, let me share a little bit about Matt Adler. Matt is a proud alumnus of WashU, a member of the class of 2008. During his time on campus, he majored in Spanish and minored in Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern studies, and studied both Arabic and Hebrew. Matt is a dual citizen of the United States and Israel, a native of Washington, DC. Matt lived in Tel Aviv during the adventures chronicled in the book, but the events occurred throughout Israel. In addition to Arabic and Hebrew, Matt speaks Spanish, Portuguese, Catalana, French, and intermediate Yiddish. Matt, welcome. To start us off, can you put a frame around your book for us?
Sure, absolutely. I think, first of all, it's just great to be here with you all. I think that it's very special to be connected with the WashU community, even during this challenging time when we can't be physically together. And I just want to give a shout out to the university because that's where I learned Arabic. So this book, in many senses, wouldn't have been possible without Arabic. And so I just wanted to show my gratitude to the university for giving me that gift. In terms of a frame around the book, I think the book is really ultimately about hope and understanding the other. And even moving beyond the concept of the other to realize what we have in common once we understand each other's culture and background and language and religion, how much we ultimately share, no matter where we're from. And that I think is the ultimate message of the book.
Very good. So some good came out of the pandemic for you.
Yeah, I think that, it's obviously been a whirlwind experience for everyone, but this really was a project that I largely did during quarantine last spring. And I think that, as we approach winter time, if people are looking for new hobbies or new ways to engage, maybe you should write a book or a blog or find some way to express yourself.
Now, I think I got from the blog that you actually came up with some of the initial frame of the book before the pandemic, but the quarantine gave you the time to actually do that, which so many budding authors actually think about doing. Well, tell us a little bit about that kind of aha moment when you thought that this just actually might be a book.
So it's really interesting. When I started the blog that is the basis for this book, Planting Roots, Bearing Fruits, it was simply a way for me to keep in touch with people in the States while I was in Israel. It was not intended to be a book. And in fact, turning a blog into a book is quite an enterprise. But I think I wrote about a lot of different topics, ultra-Orthodox Israelis, LGBT issues, obviously the Arab community, settlements, secular Jews. And so I didn't really know where to start. And so I thought, what's one of the major themes of what I've written about? And I thought it's the intersection of my minority identity as a gay Jew with Arabic speakers in Israel. And that's how I kind of cut off a sliver of the blog to turn into a book and made it more digestible.
Now, you lived in Israel for 2 years?
Mm-hmm.
And why? Why did you move?
So I think a few different reasons. One, I wanted to travel. Two, I had always been attracted to Israel ever since I was 13 years old and decided to learn modern Hebrew, which as many 13-year-olds can and parents of 13-year-olds can attest, almost no kids want to go back for more after their bar mitzvah. But I did. And so I was just kind of really attracted to the culture and my heritage. I thought about finding a Jewish partner since Tel Aviv is a very LGBT friendly city, which is where I decided to end up living. And I just wanted a new fresh start and to see the world.
So what was the dating scene like for you in Tel Aviv?
The dating scene's really competitive. Tel Aviv, because it has so many LGBT people, and because Israelis are very tough around the outside and sweet on the inside, it's really a bit of a rat race trying to date in Tel Aviv. But I will say this is that when you find someone and you get beyond the kind of tough exterior that Israelis can have because of so many things that they've been through as a society, that sweetness inside, the kindness is just incredibly generous. And so I didn't have luck finding a partner, but I did meet some really amazing people there.
I certainly think that sweetness, and that's a nice word to use, comes through in your description of folk that you met throughout Israel. Now those blogs, how many blogs did you have to work with once you narrowed that slice down?
I think that in the end, I have 20-something chapters, each chapter being equivalent to a blog or one that I wrote after the fact, because I wrote some of them while in the States. But the total number of blogs on my site is well over 100, 150, something like that. So I really had to narrow it down significantly to make it more manageable.
And we are going to be giving the address to that blog site at the end of the show, and then as well in a follow-up email that's being sent to everyone. Now, I mean, the Middle East in general, including Israel, isn't particularly known as being hospitable to LGBTQ individuals as some other parts of the world are. I mean, while Pride is celebrated, there have been disturbing reports of onlookers who provoke violence to those participating. But certainly you tell many stories, very kind stories of people through their journey of coming out in particular. So what are some of the lessons of your travels about where Israel's going vis-a-vis LGBTQ rights?
It's a really great question. I think that Israel is undergoing a huge evolution when it comes to LGBTQ rights. Not as much on the political level right now because there's a more conservative government, but even in conservative communities on an interpersonal level, including the Arab community, the ultra-Orthodox community, and the modern Orthodox community, places where you kind of wouldn't expect that change to be happening. I know, for instance, in Jerusalem has its own Pride Parade, and it's one of the most conservative cities in Israel. And like you mentioned, has sometimes been a focal point for conflict with its more conservative residents. However, that one of the largest contingents in that parade is not secular LGBT Israelis, but actually Orthodox. Orthodox gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people who've decided to remain Orthodox despite all the challenges. And that's where I view a lot of hope in the region, that you know, change can come in unexpected places.
I mean, you speak, your travels show that there are Arabic-speaking Jewish communities, and then there are these Arabic-speaking non-Jewish communities in Israel. My takeaway kind of surprised me, and in that there seemed that there didn't seem to be more differences, and I wondered, A, would you agree with that interpretation, and did that surprise you?
Yeah, I think it did surprise me in a sense because well, half of Israeli Jews are originally, like, their parents or grandparents originally came to Israel from Middle Eastern countries, which is why there are still some people who speak Arabic, like Iraqi Jews, Syrian Jews, you know, Egyptian Jews, etc. And some of those people have held on to that language and culture as well. And so I think that when it comes down to it, it's almost a return to roots that's going on in some cases, so that you have Arab Israelis who are not Jewish, who speak Arabic as a native language, like you mentioned. And then you also have these Jews who are in some cases reconnecting with their own Arabic speaking roots and finding common ground. And that's where I really find a lot of inspiration. I'll just share a quick story. There's a bakery in, I'm trying to pronounce it like it's Arabic.
Also speaking German for a second.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's my Yiddish getting in there. So there was a bakery in Tel Aviv near where I lived that was owned by an Iraqi Jewish woman who spoke Arabic fluently. There was a man working there who was a Gazan Palestinian, and then me, who was buying the bread. And the three of us had this beautiful Arabic conversation together at people from what you'd think are completely different backgrounds, but actually we found some common ground, and that common ground came through because of the Arabic language. Because I think ultimately language is a bridge across cultures. And I encourage everyone, if you get the chance to learn a new language, because it really opens so many doors and new relationships.
Now, I so appreciate, and when we had a pre-conversation, and then you already used it in this conversation, so you're kind of stealing a little bit the thunder, but the use of the word other, and I'd like you to kind of maybe give us some of the color, introduce to us some of the people where you found that there is a greater community despite so many apparent differences.
Yeah, I think one story comes to mind. When I was living in Tel Aviv, it was Shabbat, and on Shabbat, things are mostly closed down in the city. So I was alone and feeling kind of lonely. And I suddenly hear from across the street a kind of tap, 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 tap of drums. And I thought, well, what's that about? And I walk outside, And all of a sudden, there's 20 people at this house. They grab me, bring me inside, put a sombrero on my head, and hand me 2 pieces of pita with hot dogs in them, and told me to dance. And it was the most riotous thing I've ever experienced. It was kind of like out of my big fat Greek wedding. And you know, I go into the next room after I performed my dance, and the elders of the family were gathered, and they were speaking in Arabic with each other because they were Syrian and Iraqi Jews. And so I started talking in Arabic with them, and I specifically learned Syrian Arabic at WashU. And so we had this beautiful moment. And then one of them says to me, "We need to set you up with a nice girl." And I said, "Oh my God, okay." Now I look above my head, and there are pictures of ultra-Orthodox rabbis adorning the house, you know, black hats. And I'm thinking, what the hell am I gonna do? You know, I'm in their house. Am I gonna say that I'm gay or not? And then I just decided to come out, and I said, "That's not going to work because I'm gay." And there's dead silence. But then I said, "Well, are you in shock?" And they said, "Oh no, we've got that in our family too." And lo and behold, one of the young women pulls out her phone on Shabbat, which is a no-no in an Orthodox family, and she starts setting me up with guys. So you never know what to expect.
Now, you have a coming out story on top of a mountain. So give us that one a little bit, and maybe kind of put it in the context, because coming out is this process that almost happens or happens repeatedly in one's life. I mean, you just said it again. Should you come out again as an adult when you're traveling in the world? So, you know, kind of maybe relate a little bit to your own coming out story.
Sure. So I have a couple ones. The one I think you're referring to is where I come out to an Arab Catholic man, and it was, so I'm in this village of Tarshiha, which is in northern Israel. I had wandered around the village all day. It has beautiful churches and mosques, and I was waiting for some Jewish friends who were meeting me for sushi, because this Arab village actually has sushi. Which you would not expect. I'm waiting in the shopping center, and I see a store that sells hookahs. So I go to the store just to like chat with someone, because you can do that in Israel, and it's not weird. And I see this guy, and he is the finest, most beautiful, chiseled man. My jaw dropped. So I said, okay, I can chat with him for a little bit. So I talked to him, and within 3 questions, and we're talking in Arabic, within 3 questions, he's asking me if I'm married or if I have a girlfriend, because you can be that direct in Middle Eastern culture. And I said, no, and I pause, I'm gay. And he said, "Oh, well, what does that mean?" And I explained to him, and he said, "How did you know?" And I also told him, you know, my story as a 17-year-old figuring myself out. And ultimately, what came out of it after a bunch of questions was I said to him, "Had tabi'i," which in Arabic means it's natural. That's what being gay is. It's just natural. And he repeated it after me. And he said, "Oh, I get it now." And so now I know there's this man who's going to go back to his Arab Catholic village in the north of Israel with a changed perspective. And so I'll never forget that moment.
Is it the same crux that you think all readers get from your book? Or is there a message for an LGBTQ Jew versus non-Jew?
I think everyone has unique experiences based on their identities. So I think that, for example, being a Jew in Israel, inside Arabic-speaking communities, largely non-Jewish, you do have a certain awareness of your relation to people that's different. I traveled for a while with someone who's actually in the book as well, who was kind of a romantic figure, who was a non-Jewish American, who was spending some time learning Arabic in the region. And we traveled for a bit, and it was interesting to see because he had different points of relation as well. Because I think on some level he felt he could be more objective. I'm not sure that that's necessarily true, because we all have our own biases. But I have a certain investment in Israel because I'm a Jew that I think changes the way I relate to the country and to the people who live there.
What surprised you the most about your time in Israel?
Well, that's a great question. I think what surprised me the most is just how warm people are. The warmth, and it goes across religions in Israel and across language, and across regions of the country as well. People are so incredibly welcoming. And welcoming in a kind of radical fashion that I've yet to see in earnest in many other countries. So, for instance, I was walking around a village in northern Israel, and I looked at this woman's door, and I took a picture of it because it was beautifully decorated. And the woman said, "Tfaddal, come in." I said, "Okay." So I go into her house, and she's doing laundry and then starts pouring me tea. And by the way, I'm not a big caffeine person, but I got really, really high tolerance by the time I was done in Israel, because everyone wants to pour you tea or coffee, especially in Arab villages. And she's just sat there and shot the shit with me for an hour and a half, gave me candy, and then I went on my way. And that's just a kind of trust that I really value and love. And I think it's just one of the true gems of being in Israel.
Now, you mentioned earlier the conservative government right now in Israel. But even apart from that, the Torah is a fairly conservative religious text. I think is safe to say. What is some of that tension that you saw, or that you saw relative to liberalizing LGBT rights, and where not so much the politics, but the culture is, and the Orthodox conservative elements of Judaism?
Sure, I think, like I said, there are movements within those branches of Judaism that are more conservative to change, both by LGBT people themselves and allies. So I view that as a big positive. I think the reality is, this is kind of interesting. So the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu's party, is called the Likud, which is the main right of center party in Israel. This party is obviously more conservative. And it's not the one I or many other Israelis vote for, but many do. But what's really interesting is I was at a ceremony for Yom HaZikaron, which is Memorial Day, in my neighborhood in Tel Aviv. And it's a very conservative area where I lived. Who was the speaker? The one member of his party in the Knesset, in the parliament, who's openly gay. And he was received by these very traditional residents of the community with open arms. So I'm not suggesting that it's perfect or paradise, or it's it's going to change overnight, but I think there are real changes underway that I view as positive.
Now, you have dual citizenship, is that right?
I do.
And did you get that later on in life, or how does that work?
So it depends. So you can do what's called making aliyah, which is what I did. So that's how I became a dual citizen, which is where you immigrate essentially to Israel. And once you have it, you keep it. You know, I can go back, inshallah, as they say in Arabic. I hope to spend more time in both countries once things settle down after the pandemic. But there are some people who are born in the States, for example, to Israeli parents, who are then bestowed citizenship by virtue of their parents. So there are several different ways. You can also marry an Israeli. So if you're looking to spend some time in Israel and don't know how to get there, you can always, find a nice partner.
Is same-sex marriage legal?
Same-sex marriage receives like something like 95% of the same rights as it's not marriage, it's same-sex partnership. Receives 95% or so of the same benefits as heterosexual marriage, but you have to go abroad to be recognized. So like, because marriage it's frankly a mess. So marriage is a religious institution in Israel. There's no civil marriage. You can't go to a courthouse, no matter what your religion. So if you're Christian, you have to get married in a church. If you're Muslim or Jewish or Druze, same thing. You have to go to your religious institution. If your religious institution doesn't acknowledge same-sex marriage, which none of them in Israel do, you need to go to another country, get married, let's say in France, and then come back, and you're offered basically partnership rights. It's very complicated. There's a big struggle right now in Israel about adoption rights. There are people who are really, and I was at rallies for adoption rights in Israel for LGBTQ couples. And it's something that I think will change. I think it will change in a positive direction. Young people get it and are going to be increasingly the majority. So I hope that continues to evolve in a positive direction.
Now, don't take this with quite the cynicism that it could be read in, but you discuss lots of warmth. Your book, the stories of all your interactions with people while you were in Israel. I wonder, though, if they could tell that you were an American and therefore may have treated you nicer than if you had been from somewhere else.
That's an incredibly prescient point. I was shocked the degree to which, including in Arab Muslim communities, that you might expect there would be conflict or hostility due to, all politics of the region. Being American was one of my greatest advantages, traveling in Arab communities in Israel. Being American still has, and thank God it still manages to do this, despite all of the challenges right now. But it has a lot of cachet. People love American culture. I met Israelis who would say to me quotes from movies. And then I remember one guy, he's quoting this movie and in English. And he says to me, "What, you haven't seen Aliens 3?" And I was like, "No." I didn't even know there were that many. But really, American culture has a strong hold in places you might not expect. And so I think that actually, yes, sometimes people were nicer to me because I was American, and occasionally maybe not as nice. But overall, I think it was a positive.
In a few moments, we're going to start taking questions from the audience. So there is a question and answer feature where you can load up your questions and then they will get to us. And I recognize that we've been somewhat prejudicial in our conversation as we've talked about LGBTQ, mainly focusing kind of on the gay experience. And do you think the other spectrums, do you feel as optimistic, particularly our sisters, but trans folk as well?
It's a great question. That as a gay man, I enjoy certain privileges not over, but let's say relative to other members of the LGBTQ community, even as I'm fighting for my own rights. And I think that the situation for trans folks in Israel is not easy. I'm not an expert on it, but I will say that I remember there's a lot of folks who are scraping by, and working in prostitution, to be totally frank. However, there are other people in Israel, like Dana International, who was Israel's first trans Eurovision winner, which is a singing competition for those of you who don't know. So there's both. There's both going on, and I think as well as the bi community. I think the last Pride I was at in Tel Aviv was the Bi Visibility Pride. They have a theme each year. So there is movement in a positive direction, but there are some real challenges as well.
We have started to get some questions. And I'm curious about this one because I have only been to Israel once in my life. And unfortunately, it was during one of the, it was during the invasion of Iraq, and I soon got out. And so I was able to get to Tel Aviv and then, Jerusalem and then Tel Aviv, but wasn't able to get anywhere else. So what's the one place in Israel that you think everyone should visit? And maybe kind of amend that, what's the place that you really miss that you were at?
Oh, okay. I miss so many places. For me, the north of Israel is the most special region of Israel. It's green, it's diverse. So you have all four main religious traditions represented in the region. And there's a lot of history. So one site that comes to mind is Peki'in, Pekiin. Peki'in it's a largely Druze village. Druze are an ethno-religious minority in the Middle East. But in this village is a synagogue that has fragments from the second temple period of Judaism. So from Jerusalem from 2,000 years ago. And you can go to this synagogue and touch the stones that were in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. And regardless of how religious you are or not, it's just this surreal experience. And I think that it's worth a visit. So if you have the time and can get to Israel after the pandemic, I definitely recommend it because it's off the beaten path. This is not going to the Western Wall, which is of course beautiful, or the beaches in Tel Aviv. This is really very authentic in terms of the experiences you could have there.
And how is Israel managing the pandemic?
That depends on the Israeli you ask. But I would say overall, it's a little bit listless. A lot of Israelis are suffering economically, as people are here, but the unemployment rate is something like 20%, 27%, I believe. And what I'll say about Israeli culture is this: its good part is also its bad part, right? It's a very impulsive culture, which leads to why it's incredibly good at high tech and startups and creative arts, right? It's an incredibly impulsive culture. But it also means that when it comes to trying to regulate things and get folks to follow the rules, it can be quite difficult to corral people. So I think when it comes to things like wearing masks or keeping your social distance, some communities in Israel are really not, in particular, some of the ultra-Orthodox communities, unfortunately, are not following the guidelines. You know, I really hope it improves soon, because I miss Israel and I really want to go back and feel safe. So here's a little prayer that I'll send up for that.
Is there a further book that you are ruminating in your mind about?
There is. I'll give like a teaser. I'm not quite ready to write another book yet. It's quite a process. But one of the other major sectors that I explored was actually ultra-Orthodox Israel. I would go put a yarmulke on, a black yarmulke on, and go into Hasidic communities and hang out and eat gefilte fish and eat kugel and talk to people, sometimes in Yiddish, including from some very, very conservative backgrounds like Satmar Hasidim, who were like the most conservative group. And I would go and just have a blast, sing with them, learn with them. And so that's something I'm kind of exploring. You know, could there be a book in there about my experiences with ultra-Orthodox Israel?
Now, one of the questions we have is, thank you for the great stories. And is there, can you talk about some comparison with Arabic countries? You mentioned that you've done lots of travel, while maybe the themes aren't quite as developed in your mind, or maybe they are. Is there commonality that you think you might find if you spent such quality time in Arabic country?
Yeah, so great question. First things first is that I actually have not traveled to other countries in the Middle East. It is high on my bucket list, but it is complicated by my Israeli passport, and the fact that my American passport has an Israeli stamp in it. It's not impossible, it can be done, but there are countries that don't have relations with each other, with Israel, or recognition, etc. But it's on my list. I mean, one day, God willing, I'd love to go to Lebanon. I know Lars and I have talked a little bit about Lebanon. Lebanon is top of my list, and Syria, God willing, one day when it's more peaceful. But to answer the question, I do think there'd be commonalities. I think there's a lot of commonalities, both between Arab Israelis and other Arabs in the region, as well as Jews in Israel and the rest of the region. Like I said, half of them originally come from Iraq and Syria and Morocco, but I think beyond that, there's a shared resilience, because this is a region of the world where things are not always so easy. There's a lot of conflict and deep roots, and people who want to hold on to their identities, which is beautiful, but it can sometimes lead to a little bit too tight of a grip on those identities. And I think that is something you'd find in any Middle Eastern country, for good and for bad.
So if we come back then to Israel and going back to the theme of the other, we have a question about what to establish greater trust between
Lars, I think we lost you for a second, or at least it froze on my screen. Zoom live.
Yep, I got. You're now frozen, but I think you're moving again. Am I moving?
Yeah, we're moving.
Okay, so I don't know where we froze, and we certainly apologize to the audience about that. But kind of going back into Israel now and thinking about that theme of the other that your book so talks about. And then we have a question about kind of what's the long-term recipe to establish trust between Israelis and Palestinians?
I think the solution, to the extent that I can promote a solution, because it's an intractable, very, very sticky problem, but I think a solvable one, is Arab citizens of Israel, because these communities that I spent, something like 90% of the book talking about, they speak fluent Hebrew. They have friends that are Jews and Arabs. They have families on the other side of the border in the West Bank and in Gaza. They are the bridge that can really help bring about more understanding and peace. So I think these people that are crossing cultures on a daily basis are a perfect model for how you can bring about greater understanding in the region.
Now, somewhat facetiously, but not quite, because we do know each other a little bit, and I think we both enjoy food. So, and you did give us the bakery story, and there are some other food stories in the book. So, talk to us a little bit about some of the commonalities, some of the joy that you had with food.
Oh my God, I miss the food so much. First of all, I think the single food that I miss the most is something called burma, like spelled like the country, B-U-R-M-A. And it's like, imagine baklava, but round, like almost like a hot dog. But it's like, yeah, the dough is around the nuts in the middle, and it's a special flaky dough that's a little bit different than regular baklava, and it's just out of this world. So next time you're in Israel, you need to try burma. It's amazing. Knafe, of course, which is this cheesy, syrupy phyllo dough mess that's amazing. Of course, you have to find the best hummus. My personal favorite, just as a travel tip, is in Abu Ghosh. Abu Ghosh is an Arab village between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So Lars, you almost certainly passed by it when you were there.
Yep.
And there's a place called Abu Shukri that is just out of this world. So I could go on and on about the food, but the food culture is just incredible. It's diverse, and largely, with the exception of the baklava, it's largely healthy. There's a lot of great vegetables and produce that you can get at the market, and I can't wait to go back.
And you chose to live. This is a question from someone in the audience. You chose to live in Tel Aviv. Why did you do that? If you were going to live in Israel again for a period, would you go back to Tel Aviv, or would you move someplace else?
Tel Aviv is not my favorite city in Israel. I'll start with that. It's not a bad city. It's a really interesting city, but it is an intense city in the sense that it's very there's a lot of movement. Israelis like to compare Tel Aviv to New York, and it is nowhere near as large as New York, but it has the feel of walking quickly and just has a kind of certain intensity to it. The neighborhood I lived in Tel Aviv was a kind of more low-income neighborhood, more conservative neighborhood. And I think that while it was very interesting, it was very challenging for me because as a gay person and as a Reform Jew who's pretty liberal, there were times where I just didn't feel at ease. And we should all go outside our comfort zones, but I think that where you want to live, you want to feel at home. And so for me, what my ideal situation would be to live in North Tel Aviv, which is a little bit more relaxed and near the park, and and of course is more expensive. So if any of you would like to finance that, please feel free to give me a call.
We have a question of perhaps more than just semantics. It's noted that we've been using the word villages. Does that connote something for you that's different than a town or a city?
It's more just that I was translating from what you'd call it in Hebrew or Arabic. So in Hebrew, it's like kfar, like a village. But I didn't know there's no real difference between village and town, I would say. Other than that, obviously villages or towns in the Middle East look different than you might see in Europe, where you have like a town square. A big church or cathedral. They're much smaller, no, no real semantic difference there, I would say. But they obviously have their own shape just because of where they are in the world.
And we touched on this acknowledgement, but certainly it's good to probe it a little bit more. We have a more specific question about trans population and in Gaza, the criminalization of gayness and transness in Gaza. What can you kind of relay relative to those issues?
So it's impossible for Israelis to travel in Gaza, legally speaking, and pragmatically, it's just, you're taking your life in your hands. There's just, unfortunately, just such a high level of mistrust and conflict there that it's just really not possible. So I didn't get the opportunity to get to know queer communities in Gaza. I assume they exist because we're everywhere, but it's true. The Gaza Strip is ruled by one of the most conservative political parties in the region, Hamas, where it's not going to be easy to be openly gay as a Palestinian there. I do know there are I met actually gay Palestinians who live in the West Bank, and there's a little bit more openness. Any part of the pride spectrum, but it is still a very conservative society.
Yeah, it's a tension that I know really nothing about, but I sense that living in a country that at its root has a theology behind it must color almost everything. And you have these marvelous stories about how I think largely in positive ways by these interactions. And as we kind of wrap up, who are the people that you'd like to go back again and visit with again?
Yeah, there's this one person that stands out who's a very close friend of mine. His name is Muhammad, and he's from Rahat, which is a Bedouin city in the south of Israel in the Negev desert. I was lost in his city at night looking for a restaurant, and he helped me get there. And ever since then, this guy is just obsessed with American culture, kind of like I was talking about earlier, knew of series that on TV that I'd never heard of before. Even though he's in this very conservative Bedouin village, he's watching all sorts of sex and violence on TV, and hiding it from his family. And he's just a great guy because he's not only open to different ways of doing things in different cultures and was kind to me. He actually moved to Tel Aviv to become an accountant. And so suddenly he left his Bedouin city, his 100% Arab Muslim city, to live in an almost 100% Jewish city with a very liberal vibe. And he really, really exemplifies that kind of sense of adventure that some people have, that I identify with. And I'm looking forward to seeing him when I go back to visit.
Has the book had an audience in Israel?
It's starting to. I was just interviewed on a podcast, an Israeli podcast, that should be coming out it's called Peace Talks. It'll be coming out later in the month or beginning of November. There's another podcast that has indicated they would like to interview me in Hebrew. Peace Talks is in English. I think it is starting to get an audience in Israel. One of the challenges is that it's on Amazon, and Israel has protectionist laws with regards to shipping and taxes and things like that. That could take a whole nother presentation for us to talk about, but it is available. So if you know friends in Israel who might be interested, you can get the Kindle edition with no shipping issues in terms of taxes. And the paperback is also available. So feel free to recommend it.
Now, as we're at a university virtual event, in addition for the adventures that you chronicle in More Than Just Hummus.
So I lost you for a second, but you said to talk about the adventures that I.
Well, in addition to learning Arabic, how did your studies at WashU help prepare you for the adventures that you chronicle?
I'm glad you asked, and thank you for clarifying. I think one of the things that I learned at WashU was to respect different points of view. Not only because the curriculum requires you to dip your toe in places that might be less comfortable or less interesting to you initially. I'm not a big science guy, but I was required to sit in an environmental studies seminar. And I really learned a lot from that. So it's, there was that kind of push to get you out of your intellectual bubble. But also I was an activist at WashU. I was involved, with workers' rights, with the Jewish community, and those and gay rights as well. I actually remember going to a protest against a conversion therapy conference in St. Louis, and those opportunities that college offers you for any students who might be on are just so incredible, and take them and use them. And because I don't think I would have been brave enough to go alone into an Arab village where I knew nobody if I hadn't had that kind of experience at WashU.
Well, Matt, I certainly want to thank you. This has been fun, and I appreciate the opportunity to renew our acquaintance and to talk with you about your absolutely fabulous book.
Thank you so much for having me and for moderating this, Lars. It's just a pleasure talking to all of you. Feel free to be in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you, more questions or ideas, but I'm just really grateful to the WashU community for this opportunity.
We look forward to seeing all of you again for future programs, and to encourage you to buy and read More Than Just Hummus, A Gay Jew Discovers Israel in Arabic. It is available via Amazon in both print and digital formats. You can also read about Matt's travel and his cultural, religious, and social experiences via his blog, Planting Roots, Bearing Fruits. Links have been shared to both in the chat box and will be sent to each of you again in a survey with this event that you should get in the next day or two. Certainly stay tuned for upcoming events sponsored by the WashU Pride Alumni Network and the Alumni Association. So again, Matt, thanks to you for joining us and to each of you for being in the audience. Goodbye.